All right. We are opening our doors. Well, we'll give it a moment to let everybody get in the door. Good morning, Cecilia. We haven't seen you and it's been a while. Good morning, Gail. Good morning, David. I always tell all our guests, this is kind of my favorite part. It's like when you have a party and you invite all the people and you get to open the door and see who shows up. We haven't been on Village Chat in over a month now. We had a rather longer break than normal. We usually take a break in the summer, but because we had our sales conference to go to and some other things that hindered everything, we had to take a little bit of a longer break than typical. So I always like to give it just a moment, but it's 10:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. If you haven't met me before, my name is Candace Swick. I am the marketing director here at Westminster Village, and welcome to Village Chat in our brand new series that we're starting today that will be continuing on this fall called The Faces of Westminster. We are going to be visiting with various residents who live here at Westminster Village, as well as employees who how could I say it, have very interesting backgrounds. Our first guest is Mr. David Bunte, Westminster Village resident, and what few may know or not know, it was the voice of WBAA. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
For over 40 years.
Yeah, some people, a lot of different people have carried the moniker of the voice of WBAA. Generally, it wasn't me. It was John DeCamp when I was hired. And it's been various people have been prominent on the air over the years.
Well, I'm really excited to get to talk to you about this. You've mentioned it a few times in passing, but I have waited to ask you questions. I reserved it for today so that I could have a more authentic conversation with you. So I'm excited about that. Anyways, but welcome back to Village Chat. This will be an ongoing series through to the week of Veterans Day, where we will have some special veterans as our guest. I'm looking forward to that. So this will kind of be a longer series, and I think it'll be interesting to get to know just various folks and their backgrounds and what you're doing now and what you've done before, and it'll be fun. So let's go ahead and jump right in because I've got some pretty in-depth questions here for you. So David, for those who haven't met you, would you just please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be a resident at Westminster Village?
I'm going to start all the way back in 1943. I was born on the north side of Chicago. 2 weeks before I turned 5, my family moved to one of the western suburbs of Wheaton, Illinois, where I was raised. I went to school there. In fact, I was a junior high and high school classmate of Bob Woodward, as in Woodward and Bernstein, that wrote all about Watergate, et cetera, et cetera. And when I was getting ready to graduate from high school, I was figuring out where to go to college. And there was a college right there in town, Wheaton College. So I went there as a freshman. That's where I met a young lady that I ended up marrying. And but I did not stay at that school. I ended up getting my BS in radio and television broadcasting at Southern Illinois University. And from there, I came to Purdue. I had a professor who had gotten his master's degree at Purdue. And while he was doing that, he was working at WBAA. He called me into his office one day and asked me how the job search was going. I said, well, I've sent out 50 or so resumes and I haven't heard anything that I'm interested in. And he said, well, have you written to Purdue? I said, no. And he said, you should really write to this. I don't know if they have any openings, but he said, it is the kind of radio station you would like. So I wrote, and John DeCamp, who was the manager for many years at WBAA, wrote back and thanked me for my letter and my resume and said that he was really excited when he got it because one of his employees was out of town that day at a job interview. But fortunately, he used that word, fortunately, the person did not take the job, so he had no openings. But he said he would keep my letter on file and let me know when there was an opening. That sounded just a little bit like the check is in the mail.
Right.
But not much after that, I did get a letter that they had an opening. And it was for a position that they called chief announcer. I and 51 other people applied for the job, as I understand. And I was hired. And I really enjoyed it. And my wife and I moved here then, that was in June of 1967. And I've lived here ever since. When I got to the station, one of the things that they wanted me to do was they wanted to increase the student involvement in the operation of the station. And where I had gotten my degree, students did almost all of the on-air announcing and the production and so on. So I was experienced in those areas. And we had quite a number of students come through that in some cases went on to broadcasting, but because the broadcast curricula at Purdue University was not a hands-on operation, it was more theoretical, theory of communications and so on. Some of the most outstanding students we had at WBAA were chemistry majors or engineering majors or agricultural economics. And when I mentioned those three, I'm thinking of specific persons. There was one woman who was a chemistry major. She went into broadcasting right out of college, radio and then television. And there was a fellow in majored in agricultural economics. When he graduated, I tried to hire him, but he did not go into broadcasting. And there was another fellow that was in engineering. He left and got a job in the engineering field. Then he came back several years later and got his master's degree in the Granite School, and was in fact a classmate of mine as I was pursuing my MS in management at the Granite School. But he did some more on-air work for us as a graduate student, but then went back into engineering.
Interesting. So 1967, did I hear that right?
That's right.
Wow. So you never left West Lafayette?
Nope.
Went ahead and stayed here. And then how long has it been since you moved to Westminster?
I moved here in January
That's right.
this year,
Yeah,
2022.
it hasn't quite been a year yet.
Not quite a year, but
It feels like you've been here my whole time.
Well,
You just fit right in.
I can, I've known about Westminster for many, many years.
Yeah. You would have watched it being built.
I watched it being built. There was a period of time when I came over about one afternoon a month and read to some of the residents who were bedridden in the health center. And then I also was here for one or two other events. Sometimes, I can remember the Lafayette Flute Choir playing over here, and I had one or two daughters in the flute choir that we came over to hear that. But my wife and I probably decided about 8 years ago that Westminster was going to be our next home. We believed in the idea that someone shared with us that if you're going to live in a senior living community, you should make that move before you have to. And we've all heard stories about someone who's got a parent who's become unable to live on their own and take care of themselves, but they don't want to leave their home because they've been there for a long, long time. And it can be a difficult time. In our case, we said, okay, we will make that transition to Westminster with joy, looking forward to it. And as misfortune would have it, my wife got brain cancer in March of 2021. It was terminal. She passed less than 3 months later. But she asked me at the very onset, within 24 hours of her learning that this was terminal, she asked me to promise that I would not try to stay in the house alone for more than about a year. She knew it could be a year before an opening was available of the facility that I wanted. And I was completely on board with that. She said that because she knows I really love people. I like to be around people and interact with people. And as we had looked at various options of where we might go, Westminster rose to the top for a variety of reasons. Some of them that may not be valid reasons today. In my mind, they are. So I made the transition, and I was thrilled that before the end of the year, she had passed in June of 21, and before the end of the year, I got the call that a 2-bedroom apartment, which is what I wanted, was going to be available. And did I want to take it? Well, I came over, I looked at it. It was in the process of very early stages of renovating it. And I said, absolutely. And I was thrilled the renovations. I knew that they would repair anything that was damaged and that they would repaint. I asked with some trepidation, do I get any input on the paint color? And was told yes. So I mentioned the color that I wanted, and it was a color that the people here were familiar with because it's been used elsewhere at Westminster.
I remember.
And I didn't expect much more than that. But then as I watched them working, I have new kitchen countertops, all new flooring. And again, I was able to have input into some of that, which has helped make the place
Yours.
home.
Yeah.
The move-in was easier than I could have expected. The SOS organization in town that helps. I don't know how many people they help move where, but I've seen them around. I know they've helped a lot of people move into Westminster, and they had me move lickety split, smooth as could be. They began moving stuff over here on I think it was a Monday morning, and Monday night I slept in my own bed, and my apartment was in good shape except for some decorating, some personalizations that were a very important part of my coming to Westminster.
Yes, you have filled it with a lot of beautiful art.
It was the saddest moments I had on the day I was moving in and the week or so after was that Mary wasn't able to be there with me because I knew she was looking forward to this being her next home. And she, in fact, was well treated and taken care of in the health center until her final days. But my wife was an artist, and she dealt in many media, painting, some sculpture, soft sculpture, stained glass, ceramics. But for the last few decades, her primary expression of her creative gifts was in fabric art. She started doing some traditional quilts, but after only maybe 2 or 3 bed quilts, she moved into what I would call art quilts. And she was very prolific. Every member of my extended family has a quilt that Mary had made. I have 3 daughters, so we each have several of them. And I've got, I think, 8 of her quilts hanging in my apartment. And one quilt hangs in the hallway outside my apartment. I change it every month. And I've gotten some very pleasant comments from residents who have seen that. And this will sound corny to some people, but Mary and I were married almost 56 years. She was clearly the love of my life. And I miss her every day, but every time I walk into my apartment, it almost feels like I'm getting a hug from her.
Oh.
And that's part of the reason I enjoy sharing my apartment with other people, letting them see it. But if someone comes to see my apartment, maybe all they really care about is wanting to see what kind of flooring is put in the new apartments. I show them the quilts and tell them a little bit about them as well.
I think the quilts would be more interesting. So back to, I'm really curious about the broadcasting. What made you want to be in broadcasting? Like I don't know that I would, I don't think that's the career path as a kid that is it? Or, people say, oh, I'm going to be an actor when I grow up, but how many actually get to accomplish those things? Like, how do you end up being the voice of radio for 40 years?
I didn't start out with that as a goal. I thought at one point I would like to be an attorney. My sister thought that was probably a good choice because I was very argumentative. But then I got a sense of how much reading would be required to become an attorney and to practice law. And I've got a bit of a visual handicap that limits the amount of time that I can read. And with comfort, I thought, well, I'd like to be a writer. But I learned in college that I'm a lousy writer. In my job, I sometimes had to write reports for my boss or the board of trustees or something like that. And I found that the closest I came to being a capable writer was if I wrote everything down and then went back a day or two later and edited it to about 1/3 of what I had initially put on the paper. That's partly because I'm quite verbose. That comes as a surprise to nobody who knows me, and maybe to nobody who's been paying attention for the last a few minutes. But my mother shared with me something that just tore me up, and I wish I still had it. When I was in elementary school, They did not give out report cards, but teachers would send a little letter home. And my mother shared some of the early ones. And from, I believe the one from kindergarten said, David has the gift of gab.
You did.
The next year, and it said a few more things, but these are the parts I remember. The next year, it said David enjoys oral expression. 1 or 2 years later, the comment was David tends to talk too much. Well, I think I got that from my mother. After my father had passed and I was retired, my wife and I would go down to visit my mother in Florida for some weeks at a stretch because she was living with my sister and her husband, and they would travel around the country visiting kids and grandkids. And Mary and I would be down there for 5, 6, maybe 7 weeks at a stretch. But after a few visits like that, Mary decided she was only going to come with about every other week. Because if you put my mother and I in the same room, my mother would tend to talk about 65% of the time. And I would tend to talk about 65% of the time. And Mary didn't have a big enough crowbar to get a word in edgewise. So
she just left you to your own devices.
Really, she did. In fact, on one of the trips, she took her sewing machine and she was in the other room making quilt tops and so on for hours on end. But when I was maybe approaching my teenage years, 11, 12 years old, I built a crystal set. And I loved listening to the radio. I'd started listening to the radio regularly by the time I was 5 or 6. And we had a big console radio in the living room, and I would tune into things like the Lone Ranger and the Shadow. And I would sit on the floor and just lean my ear against the loudspeaker and have it very low. So my sister could not be traveling into the world as I was through my imagination. But I enjoyed radio a lot. And somewhere around age 13 or 14, I got really fascinated by the technology of sending sound over long distances without wires. And that made the crystal set was a lot of fun. And we had an old radio in the basement of our house that didn't work, but my father helped fix it up, showed me how to test tubes and how to figure out what was wrong. And we got the radio working, and it was a radio on which I could tune into many different frequencies. And I can remember when I was 12, 13, 14 years old, listening to Radio Moscow or HCJB down in Quito, Ecuador, or the BBC and various broadcast operations they had in many different parts of the globe. And that really fascinated me. And then I also tuned across one place and I heard people talking back and forth to each other, just having conversations. Maybe somebody in San Diego talking to someone in Denver and they're comparing the weather. And I thought, wow, these are just ordinary guys talking on the radio. And so I wanted to learn more about that. I learned about amateur radio. And I, as a teenager, before I was old enough to drive a car, I got my amateur radio license and got a transmitter and receiver and started actually communicating with people in near and distant places.
You don't, with how media is today, you just don't think about the possibilities of these things. Of course, now we can all get on YouTube, right? So is that the same sort of parallel?
Maybe cell phones are in a way.
Yeah.
The difference is that I think a lot of the stuff on YouTube is people just sending things out.
Right.
In some of the social media, it's interactive, communicating with other people. And that's what the ham radio is about. And for many, many years, well, it's been my hobby for almost 65 years. And I enjoyed working distant places. And I got to be pretty good at it through some good fortune and through some hard work. And in fact, I've spoken to someone in every country you can name, except North Korea.
Wow.
And in fact, I did talk to somebody in North Korea, but on my certificate for the talking to all these countries, I can't count that because the person who was there was not on the air legally. And so that didn't count. But in the last 10 or 15 years, my focus has changed. I still like to work the faraway places, but I engage in longer conversations whenever I can. Just yesterday morning, I talked to a friend in Ohio for 20-25 minutes
So through radio.
through radio. And in
Okay.
fact, one of the beauties, and it was a real treat when I moved to Westminster, is I was permitted to put an antenna on the roof of the building that my apartment's in.
Mhm.
And so I did that. And in fact, I got on the air from my apartment in March of 2022. And since that time, I've talked to people in over 100 different countries. But I've also had numerous 20, 30, 40-minute conversations with, in some cases, people I've never talked to before, and in many cases, people that are good friends.
So it's a communication device more than like broadcasting.
That's
Am I
correct.
understanding that
That's
correctly?
exactly correct.
Okay. That's,
Yeah,
yeah, that's a little different.
I don't turn on and play my favorite music for other people to listen to. It's just conversational communications. And in my case, I do it on Morse code. I have a microphone, but it's not hooked up to my radio. I talked for all my life. I talked for a living. And for reasons that I can't really explain, I find it difficult now to get on my ham radio and talk with my voice. I do it with Morse code.
So, wow. Now that takes some patience.
Yeah, but it's kind of like another language.
Yeah.
And I can do Morse code better than I can speak Spanish. And I was a Spanish minor in college.
No kidding. How fascinating. So how do you feel about how radio is now? Like now there's satellite radio. I mean, there's podcasts, there's so many different formats now. I mean, what are your thoughts on all of that?
I have maybe not listened to more than one or two podcasts in my life. The only satellite radio that I listen to is some Sirius XM because it was in my automobile when I bought it.
Mhm.
And I do like some of that, but I still listen to local radio. I listen to WBAA where I worked for 41 plus years,
Mhm.
and I don't listen to much other radio. I still feel like I'm part of the WBAA
Sure.
family, even though I retired at the end of 2008. It's still important to me. But all of these other aspects of the media, they're tools. They are means of communicating.
Mhm.
I am concerned about how some of them are used. Like many people, I'm not on any of the social media, but I hear about bullying and taunting and some of this kind of stuff, and nefarious characters trying to take advantage of other people through the media, and that kind of thing. That kind of thing has always occurred. Many years ago, there were people going around in wagons selling snake oil or whatever, bilking people out of money with supposed cures for this or that. Some of that came into broadcasting way back in the 20s and 30s. And so it is not that the expansion of media has created these opportunities, but there are perhaps more of them and
I
more
would say
people.
it's maybe more accessible.
Yeah, more accessible.
Yeah.
And it's
Human nature hasn't changed.
yes, I think that's a good way of putting it. It has made it easier for more people to be touched by it.
Yeah.
And that can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing, but it's like any tool. A sharp knife can be a very important tool, or it can be used for harm.
Yeah, very true. That's a good way to put that. So tell us one last thing before we go, because we're going to come up on time here. Tell us something that might surprise us about you. So we know that you're a radio guy. We know that you were married to an artist. We now know that you talk through Morse code. That was a shock to me. I didn't know that one. So I feel like we know quite a bit. Is there anything that might surprise us?
Something that I think will probably surprise you, because it has surprised many, many people, is that at my core, I'm very shy.
No.
I really enjoy interacting with people, but sometimes it's hard for me to take that step. Also, because I'm quite verbose, I sometimes monopolize conversations. I'm not proud of that, but it's sometimes easier for me to feel like I'm in control of the conversation than to try to figure out how I can fit into the conversation. My wife was always more outgoing than I was, but I can remember being on a cruise. I would end up speaking to strangers and she was surprised. But it was, part of that was an attempt on my part to get over that innate shyness. And I've got to tell you one quick story that it just cracked me up. We were on a cruise through the Panama Canal. One morning we got into the elevator and there was another couple in the elevator and we said, good morning, and just asked where they're from. And Nebraska. Well, my wife has relatives in Nebraska. So we said, where? Oh, a little town you've never heard of. She said, try me. And he said, Berwyn. She said, Berwyn, I got relatives in Berwyn. And mentioned the aunt and uncle of hers. These people knew them. They'd visited with them the day before they left on the cruise. Well, if I hadn't spoken up,
You wouldn't have found out.
Mary probably wouldn't have spoken up, and we might have missed that. As it turns out, we had met some more people from that part of Nebraska and had numerous great visits on the cruise.
I think it's, my husband and I love to cruise, and I think it's always fascinating. Well, we always make friends every cruise. And I can't tell you how many times we meet people from either Indiana or even right here in Lafayette or Crawfordsville. It's just so odd.
I remember being in Denali in Alaska, waiting for the train to take us down toward our ship, and I look over and there's somebody wearing a Purdue jacket. So I went over and talked to him. He and his wife were both Purdue grads. They were with, I think, her brother and his wife. She was a Purdue grad, he was not. So we had just a few moments of fun picking on the IU grad.
Well, if anybody has any questions for David, you can type those in the Q&A if you had any interesting questions about radio. I have found this to be fascinating. Let's hop over to Stephanie, because we're coming up on our time here, and get some updates on marketing.
Good morning, everyone. I always say that our residents are the best part of Westminster Village, and I think David is definitely a prime example of that. Not much when it comes to sales on the update this week, more of a sales kudos. So the sales team has spent the last week in San Antonio with other communities, over 130 other communities actually. And Westminster has won some awards. So I'd like to share that with you. We have maintained 5 stars for 10 years in a row. That is unheard of, but we are a 5-star community and have maintained that for 10 years in a row. Also within the 130 communities, 86 of them received awards. And Westminster was one of maybe 2 or 3 that won occupancy awards in all 3 categories, which was skilled nursing, assisted living, and independent living. We've been able to maintain 95% or greater occupancy and actually hit 100% in assisted living and independent living. So this is just such a great place to be, especially with residents like David. And we have some new homes coming in different areas of the community. So if you're on our list and you're ready, give us a call. Maybe one of your homes is coming available. But that's all I have. Great job to Team Westminster, and back to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, it was pretty exciting. It's a really neat place. I think all of us feel pretty honored to get to represent Westminster Village.
Something Stephanie said early on there was about the best thing about Westminster is the residents.
It is.
And I like the staff here a lot, but the residents really are, because I've made so many friends.
Yeah.
I already knew a bunch of people that lived
Yeah.
here, and it's been nice to reconnect with them. But oh my goodness, I've got friends that I consider among my dearest friends on earth that I met since I moved in last January.
That's just, it makes me so happy. That makes me so happy to hear. I know I look forward to you popping into our offices.
Well, you have candy.
We have candy that this man stocks. I stock candy, but David brings in candy too and fills up the jar on occasion too.
The jar is pretty empty. I noticed this morning.
It
I
is.
have to make another trip to
I've got to
Sam's.
I actually have to make a run today for tomorrow. So I'll make sure to fill it up for you. And good news is it's Halloween time. So all the plethora of candy is out. So we'll enjoy that.
We'll get the good stuff, David.
We'll make sure you're taken care of. So next week we have Ann Hunt joining us. She is a resident here on campus. She's a writer. She does a lot of interesting things. She writes a lot of articles for the village, not a newspaper, but newsletter. I use some of her material for Facebook and things like that, but just an interesting woman. She's involved in quite a bit. So I'll be looking forward to having that conversation with her.
Me too.
But thank you for kicking this off, David.
Oh, I loved it.
What a fun 30 minutes, and I hope you all enjoyed it. I will be sending this out via recording for those who missed it live, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye. Have a great Tuesday and enjoy the, fall weather.
Yeah.
It's the type of weather to get a cup of tea and curl up. But have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.